The night before my son's wedding, I learned why my future daughter-in-law hated me, and it wasn't what anyone thought. Linda Parker was 58, a mother who had spent decades building a life around one child. The night before my son's wedding, I sat alone in a hotel room overlooking a quiet suburban parking lot. Outside, the orange glow from streetlights reflected across damp pavement, and inside, the air conditioner hummed steadily. The room felt clean enough, yet strangely empty, like a place meant for passing through, not celebrating family milestones. Just hours earlier, I had attended the rehearsal dinner, and it should have been one of the happiest evenings of my life. Instead, I spent most of the night smiling politely while feeling invisible. Conversations shifted whenever I approached. Chairs filled before I could sit, and relatives offered brief nods instead of warmth. Even the scent of roasted chicken and fresh bread could not hide the tension surrounding me there. My future daughter-in-law barely looked at me. Whenever our eyes met, her expression tightened for a second before she turned away. I had seen that look many times over the years, and it always carried the same message: she did not want me near her. Her voice remained polite, her behavior technically respectful, yet something colder lingered beneath every interaction, creating distance where family should have existed for years already. I never understood why. From the moment my son introduced us, I had tried to welcome her. I remembered birthday gifts, thoughtful messages, invitations to lunch, and careful efforts to respect her boundaries. Each attempt seemed to disappear into a wall I could not see. Over time, rejection became expected, but it never became painless. The memory still stung whenever I watched other mothers laugh easily with future daughters-in-law nearby. What hurt most was seeing the effect on my son. He never spoke harshly, he never demanded distance, and never openly chose sides. Still, little things changed. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent, and family traditions slowly slipped away. Sometimes he seemed nervous around me, as though he worried about saying the wrong thing. I blamed adulthood, careers, schedules, relationships, and every reasonable explanation I could imagine back then alone. As I sat on the edge of the bed, I found myself thinking about the years after my divorce. I had worked extra shifts, postponed promotions, and stretched every dollar to keep our household stable. There were nights when exhaustion settled into my bones, yet I still helped with homework, attended games, and showed up whenever he needed me. Tomorrow should have felt like a reward for all that effort. Instead, I felt like an unwanted guest. After returning from dinner, I removed my earrings, folded my jacket, and stared at the welcome bag left by the wedding party. Tissue paper rustled softly, and the faint smell of lavender drifted from a small candle. I wondered whether anyone else noticed how often people avoided sitting beside me. The thought sounded paranoid, yet the pattern had become impossible to ignore lately. Near midnight, unable to sleep, I decided to organize the papers scattered inside my purse. I was searching for tomorrow's schedule when a folded packet slipped onto the carpet. At first, I assumed it belonged to the wedding planner. The pages looked worn, as though they had been handled many times. Curious, I bent down, picked them up, and noticed a familiar name printed near the top of the page. My stomach tightened immediately. The document referenced events from years earlier, events connected to my family and my son. As I continued reading, confusion slowly gave way to something else. Certain phrases felt strangely familiar, echoing assumptions I had encountered before. Suddenly, scattered memories began lining up. Awkward comments, unusual questions, and unexplained coldness no longer seemed random at all, but parts of a story someone had been telling years. I did not fully understand what I was looking at, and I was not ready to accuse anyone of anything. Yet for the first time, the problem seemed bigger than a simple personality conflict. The hostility directed toward me suddenly felt learned, not natural. I sat quietly, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, holding those pages in trembling hands and feeling suspicion settle gently beside my loneliness tonight. Several years earlier, before wedding plans and uncomfortable silences, everything had seemed simple. My son called one Saturday afternoon and asked if he could bring someone to dinner. The excitement in his voice made me smile immediately. I remember standing in my kitchen with the smell of garlic and onions filling the air, feeling genuinely happy that he had found someone special. When she arrived, she made a wonderful first impression. She was confident without being arrogant, polite without seeming rehearsed, and she looked directly into people's eyes when she spoke. She brought a homemade dessert and thanked me twice for inviting her. Watching my son sit beside her, I could see how much he cared. That evening felt easy. We laughed around the dining room table, shared stories, and talked long after dinner ended. She spoke about her career goals, her close relationship with her parents, and the future she hoped to build someday. Everything about her suggested stability, kindness, and ambition. As a mother, I wanted my son to be happy. I had spent years worrying about him, wondering whether he would find someone who appreciated his good heart. That night, I drove myself home from the restaurant where we met afterward feeling relieved. I honestly believed he had chosen well. Over the following months, she became a regular part of family gatherings. She attended birthdays, holiday dinners, and weekend cookouts. The sound of laughter usually filled those events, and she seemed comfortable enough. Looking back, I can still remember the scent of charcoal from summer barbecues and the cheerful noise of relatives talking over one another. The first warning signs were so small that I barely noticed them. Whenever I shared childhood stories about my son, she would become unusually quiet. It wasn't dramatic. She would simply stop smiling or look down at her drink. At first, I assumed she was shy or worried about embarrassing him. Many girlfriends reacted that way. One Thanksgiving, I told a funny story about a school talent show he participated in when he was 10. Everyone laughed, including my son. She smiled too, but something about it seemed forced. A few minutes later, she excused herself and spent almost 20 minutes helping in the kitchen even though dinner was already finished. I told myself it meant nothing. As time passed, my son began missing small family traditions. He skipped our annual movie night one December. Then he missed a spring picnic that he had attended every year since childhood. His explanations sounded reasonable. Work was busy, plans changed, life happened. That was what adults did. Our phone calls gradually became shorter as well. Conversations that once lasted an hour now ended after 15 minutes. He always sounded friendly, but there was a distance that hadn't existed before. It felt subtle enough to ignore, so I ignored it. Meanwhile, his girlfriend politely declined more invitations. She was never rude. She always had a believable reason. A work commitment, a family obligation, a scheduling conflict. Every explanation made sense individually. Together, they started creating a pattern. Family vacations slowly became divided. Holidays required negotiations that never used to exist. Some years they spent Thanksgiving elsewhere. Other years they arrived late and left early. I missed them, but I convinced myself this was simply part of growing older. A few friends noticed before I did. One afternoon, while having coffee with a longtime neighbor, she carefully suggested that I'd be getting pushed to the edge of my son's life. The comment surprised me. I immediately defended both of them. The idea that someone might intentionally create distance felt unfair. I refused to consider it. Still, odd moments continued happening. Sometimes conversations stopped when I entered a room. Other times, relatives gave me strange looks after speaking with my son and his girlfriend. I could never identify a specific reason, yet something felt slightly off, like hearing a faint sound through a wall without knowing where it originated. Then came the comments. Every now and then, my son would mention something that didn't make sense. He would reference events from years earlier in ways I barely recognized. Once, he implied I had been less involved during his teenage years than I actually was. Another time, he questioned a decision I supposedly made, even though it had never happened. The accusations weren't direct. They appeared briefly and disappeared just as quickly. I always explained my side calmly. He usually accepted the explanation and moved on. Because he never argued, I convinced myself there was no real problem underneath those moments. Then they announced their engagement. I remember the excitement in his voice and the sparkle of the ring on her hand. For a little while, my concerns faded. I hoped marriage would bring everyone closer together. Families often struggled during transitions before finding their rhythm. Instead, I found myself learning about wedding plans after decisions had already been made. Venues were chosen. Guest lists were discussed. Important details moved forward without my involvement. I noticed the pattern clearly by then. I just didn't know what it meant. Wedding week arrived with all the excitement people usually talk about, but for me, it carried a strange heaviness. Everywhere I went, I felt as though I had walked into the middle of a conversation that ended the moment I appeared. The hotel lobby smelled faintly of coffee and fresh flowers, yet even those cheerful details couldn't ease the growing discomfort sitting in my chest. The closer we got to the ceremony, the more noticeable the tension became. My future daughter-in-law rarely looked directly at me anymore. When she did, her expression seemed guarded, almost cautious. She wasn't openly hostile, but there was a distance in her behavior that felt deliberate. During group conversations, she would turn toward everyone else while speaking, leaving me standing slightly outside the circle. My son wasn't acting like himself either. He smiled when people congratulated him, but the smiles never lasted very long. His attention drifted constantly. Sometimes he seemed distracted in the middle of conversations. Other times he looked exhausted, as if carrying a burden he couldn't explain. I assumed wedding stress was responsible. Looking back, I realize I wanted simple explanations. 2 days before the wedding, I attended a planning meeting at the venue. Family members moved between tables discussing seating arrangements and final details. Soft music played through ceiling speakers while staff arranged centerpieces nearby. Everyone seemed busy. That was when something happened that changed everything. A longtime family friend approached me while we waited for coffee. She had known my son since he was a child and had attended countless family events over the years. We exchanged small talk for several minutes before she suddenly said something that made my stomach drop. She told me she was glad my son had eventually forgiven me. At first, I thought I had misunderstood her. I asked what she meant. The expression on her face changed immediately. She looked embarrassed, like someone who had accidentally revealed information they weren't supposed to discuss. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly referenced difficult years from my son's childhood and mentioned how painful abandonment could be for a child. Abandonment. The word hit me so hard I could barely process it. I stared at her, completely confused. She seemed equally confused by my reaction. The conversation ended awkwardly, but the damage had already been done. As I walked away, I felt cold despite the warm afternoon air surrounding me. People thought I had abandoned my son. The realization followed me everywhere that day. For years I had assumed the tension came from personality differences or misunderstandings. Suddenly, another possibility emerged. What if people weren't judging who I actually was? What if they were reacting to a version of me that never existed? That evening, memories started resurfacing. Comments that once seemed random suddenly carried different meanings. Strange questions from relatives. Awkward pauses during conversations. Expressions of sympathy I never understood. Even some of my future daughter-in-law's reactions began making sense through an entirely different lens. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Back in my hotel room, I started searching through old photographs stored on my phone. Pictures from school events, birthday parties, soccer games, family vacations. Image after image showed exactly what I remembered. For years spent actively raising my son. The accusation felt impossible. Still, the more I thought about it, the more pieces began fitting together. I remembered occasions when my future daughter-in-law seemed uncomfortable, hearing stories from my son's childhood. Maybe those stories contradicted something she already believed. That possibility hurt more than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I quietly called home and asked a neighbor to check a storage box in my attic. Inside were records I had kept for decades. School documents, medical paperwork, photographs, report cards, and old calendars. Evidence of ordinary parenting that stretched across years. By afternoon, she had sent me pictures of everything. As I reviewed the documents, painful memories returned. My divorce had been difficult. There were custody discussions, financial struggles, and countless sacrifices. I remembered working late shifts, rushing to school events, and stretching every paycheck further than seemed possible. None of it matched the story I was beginning to uncover. What frightened me most wasn't what strangers believed. It was the possibility that my son had heard some version of it too. Maybe not all of it, maybe not even consciously, but enough to create doubt where trust should have existed. The thought broke something inside me. Late that night, I sat alone reviewing old records while wedding celebrations continued elsewhere. Gradually, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. This story hadn't appeared by accident. Someone close to the family had been telling it for years. For the first time, I stopped questioning whether a lie existed. I started wondering who had benefited from it. After realizing someone had been spreading a false version of my life for years, I stopped looking at random incidents individually. Instead, I began examining them together. Like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a table, they started forming a picture I had never wanted to see. And every path seemed to lead back to my ex-husband. Even thinking it felt painful. We had divorced when our son was young. The marriage had ended badly, but I spent years convincing myself that we had eventually found a workable balance. We attended school events together when necessary, avoided major arguments, and managed to raise our son without open warfare. At least that was what I believed. The more I reviewed old memories, the more uncomfortable details resurfaced. There had been moments when information mysteriously failed to reach me. Parent meetings I learned about too late. Schedule changes I wasn't told about. Important conversations that somehow happened without my knowledge. At the time, each incident seemed isolated. Now they looked different. My ex-husband always cared deeply about appearances. He liked being seen as dependable, responsible, and steady. Friends often described him as calm under pressure. Relatives trusted his version of events because he presented them confidently. I used to think that confidence came from maturity. Now I wondered whether it came from control. Sitting alone in my hotel room, I began searching through years of saved emails. The glow from my laptop illuminated stacks of paperwork spread across the desk. Outside, distant traffic moved through the night while I carefully opened message after message. What I found made my heart sink. Several emails contained subtle distortions of events I remembered clearly. Nothing outrageous, nothing dramatic, just small adjustments that consistently painted me in a worse light. Missed details became personal failures. Scheduling conflicts became signs of disinterest. Ordinary disagreements became evidence of neglect. Each example seemed minor on its own. Together they formed a pattern. I found old messages sent to relatives after family disagreements. I found explanations offered to mutual friends. Again and again the same theme appeared. He positioned himself as the reliable parent carrying extra responsibilities while quietly suggesting I was less involved than reality reflected. The lies weren't loud. That was what made them effective. For years, family members repeated those stories without realizing they were repeating distortions. Every retelling moved further from the truth. Eventually, people stopped questioning the narrative because they had heard it so often. I started understanding how the damage had spread. The realization became even more painful when I considered my future daughter-in-law. If she entered the family years after the divorce, she would have encountered these stories already established as fact. She trusted the people telling them because she had no reason not to. From her perspective, the picture looked completely different. That thought softened some of my anger toward her. Not all of it, but enough. The person I worried about most was my son. I didn't believe he consciously hated me. Yet children absorb information even when nobody directly teaches it to them. If he heard subtle criticism for years, it could shape his understanding without him realizing it. The possibility broke my heart. The next day, I watched him during another wedding meeting. He seemed distracted again. His shoulders remained tense and he rubbed the back of his neck repeatedly while people discussed final details. For the first time, I wondered whether he felt trapped between conflicting versions of reality. Maybe he wasn't choosing sides. Maybe he didn't know what to believe. Part of me wanted to confront everyone immediately. I imagined gathering relatives into one room and presenting every document, photograph, and email I'd collected. The anger building inside me demanded release, but another part of me knew that would be a disaster. The wedding was only hours away. A public confrontation could destroy relationships permanently. It could embarrass my son and turn one of the most important days of his life into chaos. I forced myself to stay patient. Instead of reacting emotionally, I focused on gathering proof. I organized records chronologically and saved screenshots of relevant messages. Every claim needed evidence. Every memory needed support. If I addressed this situation, I wanted facts stronger than feelings. Slowly, I began speaking with a few trusted relatives. I chose people known for fairness rather than loyalty. Their reactions surprised me. Several admitted they had always assumed certain stories were true simply because they had heard them repeatedly. Others looked troubled when I showed documentation contradicting what they believed. For the first time, doubt entered the narrative. I could see it happening. Questions replaced certainty. Assumptions weakened. People started examining details they had previously accepted without hesitation. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was real. As evening approached, I sat quietly with my growing collection of evidence. The hurt remained and the anger certainly hadn't disappeared. But beneath both emotions, something new was beginning to form. I finally had proof. And with proof came a plan. By the time midnight approached, I knew I couldn't carry the truth alone any longer. The wedding was only hours away, and every minute that passed made the situation harder to ignore. I wasn't interested in revenge or humiliation. I simply couldn't allow a lie to remain untouched while it continued shaping my family. After a long period of hesitation, I asked my future daughter-in-law if we could talk privately. She seemed surprised by the request. We met in a quiet sitting area near the hotel lobby. Most guests had already gone to their rooms. The soft yellow lamps cast warm pools of light across the carpet, and distant elevator chimes echoed occasionally through the hallway. The atmosphere felt calm, but the tension between us was impossible to miss. She sat across from me with folded arms. I could see caution in her eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I carefully placed a folder on the table between us. Inside were photographs, school records, medical documents, calendars, emails, and years of evidence that reflected the reality of my son's childhood. I told her I wanted her to see something important. At first, her reaction was exactly what I expected. She listened politely, but skepticism lingered on her face. Years of assumptions had created a powerful narrative. No matter how much evidence sat in front of her, part of her still expected to find confirmation of what she already believed. I couldn't blame her for that. People rarely question stories they have accepted for years. Slowly, I began organizing the documents into a timeline. School events attended, medical appointments, scheduled parent conferences completed, vacations taken together, birthday parties celebrated. Every piece fit neatly into a record of active involvement that contradicted the image she had been given. The confidence in her expression started fading. She picked up photographs and examined them carefully. Several showed moments she clearly hadn't known existed. Others included dates and details that directly conflicted with stories she had heard from multiple sources. For the first time, uncertainty appeared. The conversation lasted much longer than I expected. Eventually, I showed her emails that revealed how certain events had been described differently to different people. The language wasn't dramatic. That was what made it so effective. Small distortions repeated consistently over many years had created a completely different version of reality. She grew noticeably quieter. Several times she looked away and stared at the floor. Her posture changed as she processed information she had never seen before. I could almost watch old assumptions colliding with new facts in real time. Then something unexpected happened. One of the relatives I had spoken with earlier joined us briefly. Without realizing the significance, they confirmed details from years ago that matched my records perfectly. Another family member later did the same. Neither had any reason to protect me. They were simply telling the truth. Each confirmation weakened the false narrative further. As the discussion continued, hidden patterns became impossible to ignore. Important events had been selectively described. Context had been removed. Certain stories had been repeated constantly while others disappeared entirely. The result was a version of me that barely resembled the person sitting there. My future daughter-in-law finally understood that. The realization hit her hard. She admitted there were many things she had always accepted without questioning. She had trusted the people who shared those stories because they seemed reliable. Over time, she formed conclusions that felt obvious. She never considered that the foundation beneath those conclusions might be flawed. Listening to her wasn't satisfying. It was heartbreaking. Because behind her hostility was a misunderstanding that had shaped years of our relationship. Every cold interaction suddenly looked different. Every uncomfortable holiday, every declined invitation, every moment of distance, they all stemmed from a belief that never should have existed. Eventually, my son joined the conversation. He looked exhausted before he even sat down. As evidence was presented, I watched emotions move across his face one after another. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, pain. Some of the documents were familiar to him. Others were completely new. The room felt impossibly quiet. He began asking questions. Not defensive questions, honest ones. As answers emerged, pieces of his own history started rearranging themselves. Memories he had never examined closely suddenly carried different meaning. Conversations from years earlier sounded different when viewed alongside actual records and evidence. I could see the weight settling on him. Neither of us raised our voices. There was no dramatic confrontation and no angry speech. I wasn't interested in punishment. Our goal was never to embarrass anyone. All I wanted was for the truth to exist in the same room as the lies. That alone was powerful enough. By the end of the night, the atmosphere had completely changed. My future daughter-in-law looked embarrassed and deeply saddened. My son appeared shaken. Several relatives who learned the details began reconsidering years of assumptions. One by one, long-held beliefs collapsed under simple facts. The deception that had quietly shaped our family for years was finally visible. Nobody could pretend it was a misunderstanding anymore. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too consistent, and the truth too well documented. For the first time, everyone was looking at the same reality. Wedding morning arrived with clear skies and cool air drifting through the hotel courtyard. Guests moved through hallways carrying garment bags and coffee cups while excitement slowly filled the building. Everything looked exactly the way a wedding morning should look. Yet for me, everything felt different. The truth had finally surfaced the night before, but the emotions surrounding it had not disappeared. I woke after only a few hours of sleep and sat quietly beside the window. Sunlight stretched across the parking lot below while I tried to prepare myself for the day ahead. I made one decision before leaving my room. I would not create a scene. There was a part of me that wanted accountability immediately. Years of misunderstanding could easily have fueled a public confrontation. But this day belonged to my son and his future wife. Whatever happened next, I refused to turn their wedding into a battlefield. The facts were already doing the work. They no longer needed my anger. Shortly before the ceremony, my son asked if we could speak privately. We stepped into a quiet hallway away from the guests. The scent of fresh flowers lingered nearby and distant voices echoed from the ballroom. For a moment, he struggled to find words. Then he apologized. Not casually. Not out of obligation. I could hear genuine regret in his voice. He admitted that certain assumptions had influenced him for years. He confessed that some things never completely made sense, yet he rarely questioned them because they had existed for so long. Listening to him was harder than I expected. Part of me wanted to embrace him immediately. Another part remembered years of distance and confusion. Healing could begin that day, but it could not erase everything overnight. I accepted his apology. I just wasn't ready to pretend the damage never happened. A little later, my future daughter-in-law approached me as well. She looked exhausted and emotional. The confidence she normally carried seemed replaced by uncertainty. She apologized too. There were tears in her eyes as she acknowledged how she had treated me. She admitted she had accepted stories without verifying them. She admitted she had judged me based on information that turned out to be deeply misleading. I listened carefully. What surprised me most was that I felt very little satisfaction. The previous night had exposed the truth, but it had also revealed how thoroughly she had been misled. Her actions still hurt, yet I could finally understand where they came from. That understanding didn't erase responsibility, but it made forgiveness feel possible someday, just not instantly. Meanwhile, something else was happening throughout the wedding. People were behaving differently around me. Relatives who normally kept conversations short suddenly lingered. Family friends approached with warmth that had been absent for years. Several people asked questions about old memories and family stories. The shift was subtle but impossible to miss. Respect was returning, and nobody had been forced to give it. Across the venue, I occasionally noticed my ex-husband watching interactions unfold. His usual confidence seemed strained. He remained polite, but there was tension in his posture and hesitation in his conversations. For years, his version of events had gone largely unchallenged. Now people were asking questions. As relatives compared information and discussed what they had recently learned, inconsistencies became increasingly difficult to ignore. The more he attempted to explain certain details, the more contradictions appeared. He wasn't being attacked. He was simply losing control of the narrative. That difference mattered. I never confronted him publicly. I never demanded apologies in front of guests. I never announced what had happened. Instead, I allowed documented facts to speak for themselves. Ironically, that restraint proved more powerful than retaliation. Guests naturally noticed who remained calm and who seemed defensive. They noticed who focused on the wedding and who appeared concerned about conversations happening nearby. Without intending to, people began drawing their own conclusions. The ceremony itself was beautiful. As I watched my son standing at the altar, I felt pride mixed with lingering sadness. The years behind us could never be recovered, but at least the future no longer rested on a foundation of lies. That realization brought unexpected peace. During the reception, my son stood to thank family members who had supported him throughout his life. The room glowed with candlelight, and soft music drifted through the air. Guests listened quietly as he spoke. Then he mentioned me. He thanked me for sacrifices I had made while raising him. He acknowledged challenges I had faced as a single mother. His words weren't dramatic, but they were sincere. The room responded warmly. I felt something loosen inside my chest. Nearby, my future daughter-in-law smiled at me for the first time without hesitation. It wasn't a perfect ending. Too much history existed for that, but it was a beginning. By the end of the evening, the wounds remained, yet healing had started. The lies that once separated us had lost their power. In their place stood something stronger, built slowly through truth, accountability, patience, trust, understanding, respect, and hope. Several months have passed since my son's wedding, and life feels different now. Not perfect, not magically repaired, but different in ways I once thought might never be possible. Some wounds heal slowly, especially when they involve family, trust, and years of misunderstanding. Still, healing has begun. One of the first things I noticed after the wedding was how often my son started calling again. The conversations weren't forced, they weren't scheduled out of guilt or obligation. They felt natural, like the relationship we used to have before invisible barriers settled between us. Sometimes we talked about ordinary things, work, home projects, weekend plans. Those simple conversations meant more to me than grand gestures ever could. They reminded me that relationships are usually rebuilt through small moments repeated consistently over time. Trust returns quietly. My daughter-in-law changed too. At first, our interactions remained cautious. Neither of us pretended the previous years had never happened. There was too much history for that. But instead of avoiding difficult realities, she acknowledged them openly. That honesty mattered. She began reaching out more often. Sometimes she invited me to lunch. Other times she called simply to ask for advice or share updates. None of it felt performative. She seemed genuinely interested in building a healthier relationship. Respect replaced suspicion, and slowly, affection followed. Family gatherings feel different now as well. The atmosphere has changed in subtle ways that are difficult to explain unless you've experienced years of tension firsthand. Conversations flow more naturally. People seem more comfortable. The awkward pauses that once followed me into rooms have largely disappeared. I no longer feel like an outsider. That alone is a gift. Of course, not every consequence belonged to me. My ex-husband experienced changes of his own. Nobody publicly attacked him. Nobody organized some dramatic family rejection. Instead, something much simpler happened. People stopped accepting every claim without question. Credibility is a strange thing. It takes years to build and only moments to damage. Once relatives realized portions of the family narrative had been distorted, they became more cautious. They asked questions. They looked for context. They verified information instead of assuming accuracy. The shift was noticeable and entirely self-inflicted. Watching that happen taught me something important about lies. Most people imagine deception as a single dramatic event. In reality, the most damaging lies are often small ones repeated over long periods. They settle into everyday conversations. Eventually, they become accepted facts. That is what happened in my family. No single accusation caused the damage. Instead, years of subtle distortions slowly shaped perceptions until people believed they understood a story they had never fully examined. The emotional cost was enormous. Relationships weakened, trust eroded, opportunities for connection disappeared. Entire years passed under assumptions that should have been questioned from the beginning. Sometimes I still mourn those lost years. I think about holidays that felt uncomfortable for reasons I couldn't understand. I think about invitations declined, conversations shortened, and moments of distance that never needed to exist. There is sadness in that. I don't think that sadness will ever disappear completely. At the same time, I feel grateful. The truth emerged before it was too late. My son and I still have years ahead of us. My daughter-in-law and I have an opportunity to build something healthier than what existed before. Not because anyone forgot the past, but because we finally understand it. That difference matters. People occasionally ask whether I regret not confronting everyone publicly the moment I learned the truth. The answer is no. There were moments when public revenge seemed tempting. Anger often disguises itself as justice. It convinces us that humiliation will somehow heal pain. But looking back, I'm grateful I chose restraint. Facts proved stronger than outrage. Evidence accomplished what accusations never could. The truth did not need me to scream. It only needed room to exist. Once people examined the facts honestly, most reached their own conclusions. That lesson changed me. Patience is difficult when you're hurting. Waiting feels unfair when your reputation has been damaged. Yet patience gave me something anger could not provide. It allowed the truth to emerge naturally instead of becoming another argument people could dismiss. I learned the value of documentation. I learned the importance of evidence. Most importantly, I learned how dangerous assumptions can be. Every family has stories. Every relationship contains competing perspectives. But before judging someone, we owe ourselves the responsibility of verifying what we believe. Assumptions can destroy relationships. Questions can save them. Today, when I sit around a dinner table with my son and daughter-in-law, I no longer feel the weight that once followed me everywhere. There is still work ahead. Trust continues growing through actions rather than promises. But the foundation is finally honest. That makes all the difference. Peace did not come from winning. It did not come from exposing someone or proving myself right. Peace arrived when the truth replaced confusion and honesty replaced suspicion. In the end, that was enough. Because truth sometimes arrives late. It may take years. It may test your patience and break your heart before revealing itself. Yet when it finally appears, it has the power to change everything. And for my family, it did. The years behind us cannot be rewritten. The future, however, no longer belongs to a lie. It belongs to understanding, forgiveness, healthy boundaries, renewed trust, shared memories, honest conversations, second chances, and hope.